We at RPA were inspired by the Brookings maps, and this year in 2014 we've actually released interactive maps that look at the same question of access to jobs for the Metro New York region, and it allows you to basically, like on Google Maps, drag a pin to a very specific place and say, okay, if I'm a college-educated person looking for a job, how many jobs can I reach within an hour on transit? How many jobs can I reach if I'm driving? And it really enables us to compare places within our region in terms of their proximity to employment and desirability for residential locations from a totally different perspective. I like to look at, I like to compare, I think, Bridgeport and New Brunswick, New Jersey, which are about the same distance, and the transportation and highway access is completely different. So the way that those two cities kind of engage with the overall region is very different because of their transportation systems. Our keynote speaker today, he's a frequent commentator on transportation, and today his role is really to get us to understand what our individual roles here in Connecticut need to be in improving our transportation network. We will be doing a Q&A after his about half an hour remarks, and I believe the note cards have been circulated, and Mary Tomalonius, there in the second row, will be going around and collecting note cards, getting them up to me, and then I'll be doing about 10 minutes of Q&A with our speaker. So please welcome with me Rob Puentes of the Brookings Institution.
Thank you. Thank you, Manny. Good morning, everybody. Really very pleased to be here to speak with you about this topic, and particularly as Amanda set up this focus on accessibility as a framework for our transportation discussion. I do believe that this is kind of where things are going nationally. I think that given a lot of the work that's been done over the past couple of decades, past generation, on transportation, I think we recognize what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then what we need to do in the future. And this issue of accessibility, as the governor said, I think is starting to be much more important. I agree with most of what the governor said. I'm from New Jersey, so I didn't appreciate the little crack on New Jersey, but we're absolutely used to that in the great state of New Jersey. So, but again, thank you to RPA and to the Tri-State Transportation Commission, and to Lyle and his group, and everybody for having me. This is a great event. I think I'm also customarily obligated to talk about my commute. Whenever you speak about transportation, you're supposed to talk about how bad things were getting where you're supposed to be. And I know I saw Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, that movie over Thanksgiving break. Anybody else? That was my commute up here from New York yesterday, or from Washington yesterday. So what I've been asked to do is to, as Amanda says, to provide a big national frame for the discussion that you're going to have here today and hopefully off into the future. I'm not going to be that detailed about the really particular things that's going on here in Connecticut. You obviously know all of that much better than I do. We're very allergic to the, I'm from Washington, I'm here to help kind of role. That's absolutely not the role that I see for myself and we see for Brookings. We work with cities, states, metropolitan areas, public, private, civic, philanthropic, elected leaders all across the country. And even though we're a Washington-based think tank, everything that we're doing is from the bottom up. It's really trying to catalyze new kind of action and new kind of innovation, not from Washington, not from the perch in the nation's capital, but really trying to get all this innovation that's happening all across the country and have that ripple throughout the system. Eventually, Washington will be a functioning place again, and it will be responding to what's happening in cities and states and metros, but that's not happening right now. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. I am going to hit you with a lot of data, though, a lot of information that we've collected and folks at RPA and other places have done. I hope that's going to be okay. But I'm reminded by the quote from George Bernard Shaw, who said, "It's the mark of a truly sophisticated person who is deeply moved by statistics." So I hope you all are deeply moved by what we're going to present here today. So I think we all still know the context, though, for the discussion about infrastructure and transportation across the country. It's still the overhang from the national recession, from the Great Recession, still permeates every place. The sluggish recovery and the deepening inequities that are happening all across the country still drive a lot of the conversation that we're having in all kinds of areas of policy. We know the U.S. needs to grow more jobs to make up for the 8 million that we lost during the recession, some of which we may not ever get back. But we also need to create better jobs, jobs that pay better wages, decent benefits, that help people move up the scale. Because we have to stem this troubling rise in poverty that we've seen. In one decade, we went from 81 million people living in or near poverty in this country to an astonishing 107 million by 2011. We've got to change that. But we also need to make sure that as we're creating these jobs, as we're creating these better jobs, as we set up, we have to make sure that those jobs are accessible so that people can actually get to work and they don't have to spend a tremendous amount of their income to do so. This is particularly a problem in the suburban parts of the country, where the share of the nation's poor rose from 46% in 1990 to over 55% today. Now, I know this is a real downer way to start off a speech, first thing in the morning, but this really is a big part of the context. The economy and putting people back to work is what's driving the conversation all across the country. But to do that, we have to subscribe in this country to a brand new growth model. In essence, we have to restructure the economy from the one that predated the recession, which was really focused on things like debt and consumption and financial shenanigans in Wall Street and real estate in Las Vegas and in South Florida, to a more productive economy, things that are focused on manufacturing, on human capital, on innovation, on low-carbon energy, and making sure that that opportunity that comes from that new economy is broadly shared across the landscape. Transportation infrastructure, then, is critical to achieving that productive economy and to getting to our national goals, whether it's facilitating trade between places, ensuring accessibility to jobs and economic opportunity, or promoting sustainability, not just as an environmental imperative, but also as a market imperative. Transportation has to be considered part of this overall economic proposition, and we've got to move away from more of this transportation for transportation's sake conversation, which frankly still dominates the conversation in Washington. So with that as a setup, my talk today is going to focus on these three elements. The first thing is that there is a remarkable set of disruptive forces that are altering the way that we design, govern, finance, and deliver transportation projects all across the country today. Next, I'll describe more specifically how these forces are playing out here in Connecticut, and then what all this means for a transportation agenda going forward, particularly for Connecticut, but also I think there were things that we're learning from cities and states and metros all across the country. So despite the downer of the introduction about the state of the economy, this is really designed to be a positive, affirmative vision for where we make smarter decisions about our transportation investments and things that we build and things that we don't build, how we operate that system much better so it's connecting people and maximizing opportunities for all segments of society, and how we plan not just for today, for dealing with issues like traffic congestion and pinch points that bother us today, but really plan out for an economy for the future that lasts generations to come. So first, this truly is a really disruptive moment in American history. It's hard for us to understand given where our perch is, but there are urban historians who look at what's going on now and say, we haven't had changes like this in 100 years. Some say more, some say less, but really, really remarkable things that are happening in our nation today. Our transportation networks are particularly impacted by these new realities, from remarkable demographic and cultural changes to the enormous complexities that come with rapid globalization, to our changing national environment and the threats of climate change, and to political and financial challenges that dominate the discussion, not just in Washington, but primarily in Washington. I think they're going to shut down the government again today, I heard that. So primarily in Washington, but also political challenges and financial challenges we're facing all across the country. So first, demographically, it's important to understand we're still a growing country, as opposed to Germany or Japan or other parts of Europe and Asia. The nation is still growing. Work by RPA and others are starting to show this, and based on some estimates, we're going to accommodate another 130 million people in this country between now and about 2050. And to give you some sense, that's about the population that today lives west of the Mississippi River. So accommodating all this growth is going to be an enormous challenge for this country because it's going to be concentrated mostly in our metropolitan areas, mostly in the 50 largest metros, but mostly in metros all across the country. All this is going to place huge demands on our transportation systems. But they may not be the same demands that we faced in years past. We can't just extrapolate what we've done 50, 60 years ago and import that into the future. Because for one thing, we know that even though we're a growing country, and the country's been growing over the last couple of decades, driving is leveling off and dropping in some ways. And just as interesting, this chart here shows that per capita, we're driving at increasingly lower levels overall. And this is not just due to the recession. Obviously, a lot of this, that big drop-off you see, was certainly accelerated by the recession. People are not working. They're not going to be driving. But there's a whole host of other forces that are responsible. And if you kind of took that red line out further to the left, this trend lasted for a generation. This is all we did in this country. We drove more and more and more and more. Then it kind of leveled off and plateaued. Changing that around isn't just the result of one thing like the recession. It's a result of a whole host of things which we should talk about. A lot of these trends are being driven by young people. This scary picture. This chart shows that while driving is down in almost every age group, it's young people that are leading this charge. They're not just driving less, they're buying less vehicles, again, partly due to the recession, but they're getting less driver's licenses, but they're not immobile. I mean, they're actually moving around just as much as we had before. They're just doing it in lots of other ways, which we'll talk about. Next is that while 3 out of 4 commutes still occur alone in a car, the number of commuters that are taking public transit is up significantly across the country. And this is not just subway, but this is bus, this is commuter rail, this is everything else. And it's happening in different modes all across the country. But the trend mostly seems to be increasing transit use, particularly for the daily commute. The problem, as Amanda set up at the beginning and as we've talked about, is that while we've done a good job getting transit into neighborhoods, and I'll show some stats on that in a second, transit really does fall short in getting people to jobs and economic opportunity. The study that we did at Brookings that Amanda talked about shows that for the 100 largest metros, about 30% of the jobs are accessible by transit within 90 minutes. So we even gave people 90 minutes and modeled this to see how well they could get to transit. And only 30% came up. And even a 90-minute commute is pretty long and probably intolerable in a lot of ways, but still that only got us to 30% of all jobs. And while 70% of residents in metropolitan areas have access to transit in their neighborhoods, for suburban residents the share is much lower. It's only 58% of suburban residents have transit access. There are many reasons for this. Obviously, lower densities in transit areas. It's harder to serve some of these places. And it's hard to actually access jobs and to commute in an efficient way when you're in the suburban areas. But clearly, if we're going to have to stem some of these changing trends, the suburban areas are going to be the area where we're going to have to spend a lot of time. So transit is not going to be the only option. And this is partly why we think new innovations like car sharing are becoming so popular. This is not just happening in mega cities in New York and London and Paris and places like that, but happening in Hartford, happening in lots of other different places. It's not just happening in the universities where people are constricted. It's happening in job centers, in suburban job centers, in places like Houston and Kansas City. And it's not just happening with young people, it's happening all across the spectrum. So we think this is a really interesting trend to watch. It's not going to solve every challenge. It's not going to really make an enormous dent, but it's filling in an important niche that we think is an important thing to pay attention to. So there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to those kinds of trends, but those demographic and social changes that we see that are happening are matched by the transformation of the global economy. Together, Brazil, India, and China, known as the BRICS here, already account for 1/5 of global GDP, and by 2015 that share is supposed to grow to about 25%. And the rise in the BRICS also reflects the rise in cities and metropolitan areas. For the first time in recorded history, more than a half of the world's population lives in cities and metropolitan areas. And by 2030, that metro share is going to surpass 60%. It's rising nations and their rapidly growing metros that now power the world economy. And it's importantly, what is this the role of the logistics within infrastructure for things like seaports, air hubs, freight rail, border crossings, and highways. These assets move more than $51 billion worth of goods every single day in this country and support the complex supply chains that are integral to our global economy. Almost all of this trade is moving to, through, and between our nation's largest metropolitan areas. Certainly the nation's 100 largest, but the nation's 50 largest, and heavily concentrated in the top 25. They're also the source of thousands and thousands of really good-paying jobs. And the jobs at the lower end of the scale for transportation and logistics pay much better than the jobs at the lower end of the scale for lots of other jobs. They're tough to outsource, they have lots of benefits, and they're relatively stable over time. So as we think about the role of transportation and jobs, accessibility is clearly one of those things, but transportation itself also has an enormous role to play. Another driving force, then, is the imperative of lower carbon. Today in the U.S., transportation is the single largest contributor to the nation's carbon footprint. So whether it's because of gas prices or something else, we're seeing massive changes in our vehicle fleet, even since the economy has stabilized. According to the University of Michigan, the average fuel economy of new vehicles sold in the U.S. just reached a record of 25 miles to the gallon, almost 25 miles to the gallon. But when it comes to freight, we have a mismatch, because even though more and more goods are moving by rail and moving by ship, and the challenges and the complexities that come along with that, both of those are relatively clean. So moving more, but much more is being moved by truck. Bigger and bigger trucks all across the country, moving things like oil, things you'd be really surprised they're actually moving by truck around this country, and contributing more and more to our carbon footprint. So the last force that I need to mention is our political and financial challenges. They're generally different, but when you have quotes like this from a sitting senator in Washington, clearly we have problems here in this country. And I think there's a lot of recognition that the dysfunction that's going on now is a little systemic, and it's something that we're going to have to wrestle with for the time being. But even if we had a functioning Congress right now, we're facing enormous changes to the structural changes to the federal budget that we're going to have to wrestle with. This is not a partisan statement or anything. This is something that we've known is coming for a long time. We just haven't really been wrestling with it. But given the rise in mandatory spending that we know that we've projected out, given the rise in interest and debt payments that we've projected out, that, again, folks all agree with, the discretionary spending that the federal government's able to do is going to get squeezed out. It's just going to happen. And packed into discretionary spending is defense. That's part of the discretionary spending. So things like education, R&D, and transportation, and housing, things like, are all going to face this enormous squeeze. So when we think about where the help is going to come from in the future, it's really difficult to think, given the political logjam we're facing, and then the structural realities of the federal budget, that a lot of help is going to come from Washington anytime soon. And this really matters for transportation. Folks may be familiar that we're facing pretty big shortfalls when it comes with the Federal Transportation Trust Fund. We call it the Highway Trust Fund, but it's really a transportation trust fund split into two accounts, a highway account and a transit account. And you can see here from this chart that we're expected to run a deficit, I think, May of next year. I don't know what they've got pretty precise targets for when this is going to happen. I think May 2015 is when the federal government is going to, they can't run a negative balance. They'll just stop paying the states for the projects that they're doing, unless they figure out some way to patch the hole, which is what they've done over the past couple of years. They find money through different kind of budgetary schemes, and they patch it for a couple of months, and then they move on for a couple of months. It's a very unsustainable way to think about long-term transportation projects, but this is the reality that we're facing right now. The gas tax being raised would help address this problem, but again, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So what this means then is that with $1.6 trillion being spent on transportation every year by you, me, Amanda, everybody here in this room, and $170 billion on top of that coming from tax dollars and debt, from the public sector, we think clearly this is not enough. The big question then that we're facing in this country is, how are we going to pay for those things that we need in the light of these enormous demographic changes, global changes, and the fiscal and the political realities. So the next thing that I want to talk about is then how all these big national disruptive forces, which I think are generally agreed upon. This isn't, again, some insights that we had here. This is just a collection of things that we've seen going on around the country and around the world. But how is all this playing out then here in Connecticut? The first thing is that while the state's metro areas are slowly beginning to recover, like many are around the country since the Great Recession, they still lag behind many others nationally, both in terms of percent gain in jobs as well as the change in the unemployment rate. So you can see the three metros we focus on here, Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. They've each gained jobs since the end of the recession, during the recovery, about 5-6%, which is pretty good, but it's not good comparatively. Those numbers in the brackets there are the rank of the top 100 metro areas. And you can see it's generally down at the lower end of the scale. When it comes to the change in unemployment rate, again, still, unemployment rate is dropping. That's a good thing, about 3% in each of these cases, but still relatively anemic compared to other metros around the country. So it's all moving in the right direction, but not as robust as others. And when it comes to accessibility, we see similar trends nationally. This is what Amanda talked about in the intro, I know this is a busy chart here, but it shows on the left in the gray there, it's transit coverage by income in the 3 metro areas, not just the cities, but the metros, Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. And you can see for low-income neighborhoods, tremendous coverage. The transit agencies really do a great job in providing transit service to those places that probably need it the most. In New Haven, it's 100%. Ubiquitous coverage for these neighborhoods, and not so bad for median-income neighborhoods as well. A little less when it comes to higher-income neighborhoods, but pretty good coverage. You can see the policy decisions driving where the transit service goes. Where we have challenges is when it comes to job access. And for New Haven and Hartford in particular, you can see about, as we were saying, about a third of the jobs for low-income residents, a little less for medium and high. Bridgeport is the interesting question because even though this focuses on the metro jobs they can reach, there's a whole lot of jobs that folks in Bridgeport, as you know, can get to in and around metropolitan New York. So the gravity of a place like New York has tremendous impacts on the ability of folks to get to jobs in that particular metropolitan area. So when it comes to driving levels, I think the trends in Connecticut generally track what we've seen in the nation in terms of this trend of overall decline, where the dark blue shows the natural trend where we had peak VMT, maybe around 2005 or 2006, similar here in Connecticut, and then you can see the drop-off there. The interesting thing, I think, to note from this chart, though, which shows per capita VMT, is that driving rates are much, much lower in Connecticut, and historically have been compared to the rest of the country. But one area where we know that driving is up is when it comes to freight traffic. And I know this is an intolerably difficult chart to read. But I really wanted to show this because it's new work and you love your new babies. But this is stuff that we just recently did showing the freight connections between U.S. metropolitan areas and their global counterparts. And this is interactive. It's on our website. So I'd encourage you to look at it. It's really fascinating the way you can play with this data. But we're trying to show when we look at freight and logistics traffic, it's not enough just to look at pinch points on the highway and then to address those pinch points. We really want to look at, well, what goods are being produced in which metro area, where are they going, and by what mode are they getting there? And so this crazy chart, now that you look at it, shows goods that are moving in and out of Hartford metro area and where they're going for all commodities all across the country and all across the world. The top bar there is for the New York metro area, and the rest of those blues are mostly metros in and around New England. So the connections between the economic connections in Hartford are mostly to New York, to a tremendous degree, and then also to a lot of other metros in and around New England. Boston's on there, and the ones in and around Connecticut. You can see China is on that list. It's that orange bar. In most other metros, you would see China much, much higher on the list. So it's interesting when you think about what kind of investments we need to make to support transportation and logistics infrastructure. Obviously, it's airports in some ways, or it's seaports in other ways. If you're looking at these global connections, maybe for Hartford we're looking at rail, maybe we're looking at truck, but this is where the goods are moving, and these are the precise places where we're starting to locate. This is really showing it for those kind where freight moves, and then where those economic those connections are happening. We talk a lot about that. This last slide then shows on the funding side where try to put in Connecticut in the context of the federal discussion. And I thought it was interesting that Connecticut relies more heavily on federal spending compared to other states. So the pie chart there on the left shows the U.S. average. It's about 76% of the money that's being raised across the country from states and localities is coming from their own sources, only about 24% from the federal government. But in Connecticut, it's a little bit higher. About only 70% is being raised on the state and local level, relying much more heavily on the federal program, which for the reasons that we mentioned, maybe a little problematic here into the future because we don't see that getting any higher anytime soon. And then we also know that Connecticut looks like it spends less per capita than its neighboring states on transportation. It's about $400 per capita, which is twice as high as Rhode Island, but much lower than the rest of its neighboring states. Now, spending isn't everything, and the fact that they were not spending money on projects that don't matter is probably a good thing. But we think there's something telling here about the level of effort that's coming from the state and the local level compared to what we're seeing happening across the rest of the country. We can talk about that in a minute. So given all this, then, what does this all mean for a new agenda for transportation in Connecticut? But I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind, and this is the point I keep hammering home, is that a new agenda for transportation has to be rooted in a new economic agenda. Or it can be rooted in a new environmental agenda or a social agenda, but it has to be in support of something broader. Transportation, as we all know, is a means to an end. It really shouldn't drive the conversation. So a big piece of that is making sure that transportation doesn't just serve to move cars around or move trucks around, and we're not just preoccupied with solving traffic congestion in and around metros, but truly providing accessibility to jobs and economic opportunity for all segments of society. And public transit, we think, really is a big piece of that. It's truly a lifeline to major job centers, again, especially to places like New York, from southwestern Connecticut. So making sure those connections are robust really, really matters. But they're not going to connect everywhere. We're not going to be able to build out the kind of fixed rail or BRT system everywhere that's going to connect every resident to jobs and opportunity. So we like this idea of other metros and cities that, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, in and around Seattle, and around Washington, that are aggressively moving to deploy car-sharing services and privately run bus systems to fill in those coverage gaps, mostly because these densities in these places are pretty low. And I'd say, while we've done a really good job concentrating development around new stations, not just light rail, but around BRT stations, that development has mostly been residential, because there's a lot of demand for residential around these stations. We've got to make sure that we flip that dial, and we don't just focus on residential, but we try to concentrate jobs around these transit stations so that we can get people better access to those employment opportunities. The second thing then is to strengthen the economic connections and partnerships. I know we weren't really going to talk about a lot about freight in this thing, but I think freight is a really important part of this accessibility conversation. It's truly hidden in plain sight, and we've got to make sure that goods and trade can be accommodated easily. We can do that in ways that are environmentally sensitive, in ways that lower our carbon footprint, but freight is going to be part and parcel of how we recover our economy in the U.S. and all around the country because of these increasing global connections that we're focused on. It doesn't just mean building more roads for trucks, but it means that freight planning should be a true assessment of metro economies and an understanding where those connections happen. Again, that's why that crazy slide that I showed, I think, really matters. Where this goods moving, New York, in and around New England, that's where places in Hartford should probably be focusing. And as you know, Connecticut is a small state, and so goods and people go across borders all the time. So strengthening multi-state partnerships, we think, is critical. And this is a really interesting innovation that we see happening all across the country. One particular thing that we like is what's happening on the West Coast, a thing called the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange. It's not just focused on transport, but it's the three states of Washington, Oregon, and California, along with British Columbia, that are starting to partner so they can coordinate for projects that truly matter to that entire region. That's obviously a very huge region, but there's a lot on freight and logistics, and there's a lot on developing pipelines of projects. So if they're doing a streetcar in Portland, and they're doing a streetcar in San Jose, they might be able to package those together and get cheaper cars and cheaper equipment and things like that. So these multi-state partnerships, given the absence of the federal government right now, are probably going to be really, really important here into the future. This leads then, I think, to the last thing. And I think Connecticut truly can be one of the nation's can-do states when it comes to transportation, funding, and finance, because there's no cavalry coming. Have I made that point over and over again? I think I probably should move off that. But for one, you already have this Clean Energy Finance and Investment Authority, this green bank, which is a very innovative model that a lot of other states are paying close attention to and working with the governor and his team for what they learned from that and how we can replicate that across the country. We think a possible future green bank model could combine that bank and what they're lending for right now with lending for infrastructure projects, particularly those found in transportation. Right now, Connecticut does not have a state transportation infrastructure bank. 33 other states do. Connecticut doesn't have one. Maybe this is a way that we can evolve the good innovations that are happening with the Green Bank and make sure that transportation is a part of that. It would help invest smarter by aligning those kinds of investments with broader economic goals and objectives. Because it's not really a funding source, it's really more of a financing source, which is, again, a big trend that we see happening across the country. The next thing is to go to the voters. I know this is not something that we've done a lot in the Northeast and in New England, but it's definitely a trend that's happening across the country, particularly in fast-growing parts of the Intermountain West and places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Denver and Salt Lake City, these places that are building out massive, massive expansions, particularly to their transit systems. Dallas is another one. They're getting that money by going to the voters, telling them what they're planning to do, telling them how much it's going to cost, here's how we're going to pay for it, and they're approving these things. 70-75% of these things pass every election day. And the 25% that don't pass are probably stupid projects to begin with. So the voters are really good at picking out when these things matter and when they really make sense for these metro economies. In Los Angeles, which this chart shows, they went to the voters in the middle of the recession when unemployment in LA County was 22%, something like that, and they still approved the sales tax increase for huge expansion of the transportation network there. Again, I know it's not really a tradition in the Northeast and in New England, but Rhode Island just recently, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, passed a bond referendum to pay for transit infrastructure throughout the state. So going to the voters, being clear about what you're trying to invest in, we think if the projects are right, that people are willing to pay for it, if you tell them what they're going to get for that. The last thing is to pursue a market-based approach. We know that public dollars are going to be scarce. That's going to be clear. So we're going to have to leverage the money that is out there to make smarter decisions and to squeeze more, to do more with less. So there was a federal transportation program called the TIFIA loan program that was dormant for years because there was money and nobody cared about it. Now it's completely oversubscribed because everybody's looking for what the federal government can do in this case, which is to provide very cheap loans that have to be paid back, but loans that can go for all kinds of different transportation projects. I just saw this morning that they're funding the second phase of the Silver Line project in the Washington Metro, which is a transit project going out to Dulles Airport with some of these TIFIA loans. Second thing is around congestion pricing. This is a way that we've seen that metro areas are able to build out some of their highway network by not just building toll roads in the middle of greenfields, but adding on to existing roadways and making sure that those roadways are tolled. In fact, the stats I think we saw was 60% of the new roadway mileage that came in over the last 5 years was all tolled. You can do this very dynamically. You can base it on time of day. And if you're driving in the middle of the night, the toll will be very low because you're not taking up too much space that other people, where there's high demand. But if you're driving in the middle of rush hour and traffic is very heavy, you'll pay a higher toll. The technology enables everybody to do that. And we think that this is something that we're seeing really taking root in cities and metros all across the country. The third thing is land value capture. As we build out this transportation infrastructure, it opens up enormous opportunities for the private landholders that are around these transportation facilities, not just highway interchanges, which is how we built out a lot of the suburbs for a generation, but also more particularly and more complexly around the transit stations. And if we're going to build these transit stations, whether it's light rail or BRT or anything else, there are opportunities to capture that value that accrues to these private landowners and help support the payment of that new infrastructure. This is what they've done in areas in California, they've done it in Miami, they've done it in metropolitan Washington. Lots and lots of attention on using land value capture much better across the country. And the last thing is on public-private partnerships. This is not just a selling off assets to the private sector, but there's so much money that's out there right now, so much money sloshing around the world that's not landing here in the United States, mostly because we've had a municipal bond market that has provided preferential tax treatment and didn't really need it. But again, as these financing and funding challenges get tighter, lots and lots of interest in the private sector in investing in U.S. infrastructure. They need to be paid back. They're obviously looking for a return. And we've seen some spectacular failures in this country that people are very concerned about. We've also seen a lot of successes. So again, as we're looking for things in the future, as we're looking for areas where states like Connecticut and cities and metros can maybe take advantage of these opportunities in the future, we know that there's money in the private sector that could possibly go for a whole host of different transportation and transit infrastructure. So let me, I want to end here. I definitely want to provide time for questions and comments and everything else, but let me end where I began. I think as the city, as states, and the nation continues to emerge from the recession, we really need to take this opportunity to take a step back, to look at these big disruptive changes that are happening right now, and to do something very different here in this country. Particularly, I think, as we put together a new economic agenda, there is an opportunity to make sure that transportation is connected to that, and it's not driving the conversation, but is derivative of those larger goals and objectives. So I want to thank you all very much for having me, and I look forward to the questions.
Mary will be collecting any questions from the audience. Don't be shy. I'm going to start out with both a very big picture, high level question and a very local question. So I have two questions for you. One is this regional infrastructure, West Coast infrastructure exchange that you mentioned that's happening on the West Coast. How would we actually go about making something like that happen in the Northeast? It seems like a no-brainer, but nothing is a no-brainer.
Certainly. I think, so the example, how that got pulled together was mostly driven by the governor in Oregon. Governor Kitzhaber recognized that they needed expertise when it came, particularly to take advantage of the public-private partnerships that I mentioned, and their Canadian friends in British Columbia have a long track record of doing this. And so what they wanted to do was to get together so that they could develop a pipeline of projects that were investable for the private sector, so that they can almost have a one-stop shopping list for where they can go to put their money. That then is starting to evolve, so it's not just in just collecting these things for the private sector, but recognizing what projects then matter for the region as a whole. What goes over state borders? How can they, again, as I said, take advantage of purchasing of vehicles and other kinds of infrastructure so they can do it cheaper and better. So that's how that evolved. That idea is starting to percolate throughout the country. Because there's such a hunger for anything new, that really hasn't been tested yet. It's still brand new. I can tell you, I think there's 3 or 4 of these new exchanges that are starting to emerge, probably prematurely. We still need to learn more from the West Coast before we report that anywhere else. But it's definitely driven by the states. It has to be driven by the governors and their teams. And you have to have complete buy-in across these places. One example, which I'm not going to mention, is moving in the right direction, but it just doesn't have all that buy-in. It's just destined to fail. So if the governors in these regions, which I assume get together at some point to do other things, this is a low-cost, high-impact thing that they could potentially do, particularly if it's connected with the Canadian provinces, because they have a lot of resources that they can describe for the U.S. marketplace, both in terms of how we attract some of the private money, but then really do a better job making transportation decisions based on a larger economic frame. But it's driven by the governor.
Okay, great. So now to head to the other level, a lot of land use and transportation advocacy, for better or for worse, in Connecticut is done at a very local level or in a very small region of just a few towns. So what can those of us in the audience that work at that scale do to address this transportation access program and to move us into the next phase that we need to be ready for?
It's a great question. So a lot of this was very high level, and we talked about big movements, but to the very specific problem of connecting people to jobs and opportunity, it's not just these big picture things. It is things like complete streets. It's things like transit, local transit investments. It's things like bike sharing. It's things like carpooling. It's these really kind of the very particular things. So this doesn't even begin to touch that, but that's the conversation that's happening all across the country. There's a lot of interesting innovations we think that are happening, all being driven from the bottom up, because we're not going to build up new transportation infrastructure, roads, rails, or anything else, just to connect every worker to jobs. So it's going to have to be this whole range of different things that all have to come from the bottom up, because they're neighborhood-based, they're community-based, and they're probably on the local level, as opposed to the metro or the states.
And I also wondered about the lack of access to jobs in the region. As we look at new economic development coming into Connecticut and the decisions that are made about state incentives to various uses and local zoning decisions, is there a way that we can really make transit access and mobility to those locations a factor in those decisions? And are there other places in the country that we can look to that do that really well?
They do, and then they do it, and then they don't do it. New Jersey is a great example of a place that was doing it, and then kind of maybe stopped doing it. Maryland is a place that was doing it, and then kind of stopped doing it. Now they're doing it again. But I think part of this is just weeding out some of the subsidies for sprawl, right? And it's not that the market is really making these decisions in a perfect kind of environment. We're actually supporting some of these decisions and some of these investment location decisions that we don't want by building out infrastructure, mostly roads and interchanges, to get to some of these places. If we weed out some of that and then at least just have a level playing field, I think we'd see some of this come back in But then I think we should actually go even further and provide more incentives to make sure that if accessibility is a policy goal that a city, state, or metro has, that should be rewarded. And ironically enough, the federal government actually is a good example of this, where they have the program that awards money for new transit projects is now, it's such a small success, but they're letting applicants describe transit access or job access as a factor that they might consider when they're awarding some of this money. So it's getting there, but that same kind of thing could happen in cities in the states. Los Angeles is a place that's doing this. They're trying to understand, as we have new employers coming in, how can we reward them by making sure that the investment decisions they're making supports accessibility.
And is there a role for the business community in that as well? In some places, I think the leadership comes from the local business organization.
It's fits and starts. They talk about accessibility all the time. They know that getting their workers to work is critical for their bottom line. They always, in many cases, they seem to default to highway infrastructure and just making sure that that people can drive to work without too much congestion. They can park for free and all that kind of stuff. But in some places, they're starting to reorient. They recognize that it's going to take, it's lots of different, people get to work in lots of different ways. They may have 1 or 2 or 3 jobs, and so it's not just going to be a highway investment. But when it comes to accessibility as something they're concerned about, they absolutely are. They get this. It's intuitive to them. We just need to make sure they're thinking about this in a holistic way and not just around roadways.